Billy Joe Saunders has re-emerged to say that he would welcome a rematch against Chris Eubank Jr. and that he has decided not to retire following his defeat to Canelo Alvarez several months ago. In fact, when was the Canelo out? Was it last summer? I forget exactly now. Time flies. Anyway, he said, quote, "I had a conversation with my dad the other day. Boredom sets in at home. There's only so much you can do, really. There's nothing like getting a gum shield in, getting in the atmosphere. So I would come back for a big fight, and obviously he is a big fight. I'm a big fight to him, and he's a big fight to me. So listen, I'm open for talks. They can contact me direct. I'm my own boss. We can get cracking and see where it goes. But from a boxing side of things, I think he's got worse, if I'm honest. I think it's time for something for the fans. The fans have been very good to me. They've paid their money over the years to watch me. I've got a lot of supporters. I wouldn't want to rob them of that. I don't need to go in there and to prove I'm the better man than him. I already know that. But it would be good to make him look stupid." He says of the Eubank Jr. win over Liam Williams, quote, "He did what he needed to do. Liam Williams, I reckon, had a very poor night. Whether he made the weight wrong or just didn't train enough, I don't know what it was, but clearly Eubank Jr. had a better night. I had it wide, but to be fair, the boxing I saw was difficult to watch, to be honest, because trying to imitate Roy Jones Jr., he looked like a baby giraffe that's just been born. He's 32 years old. I've always said he will never be world champion, and he's not world champion at 32. I won the title in 2015, won another title after I lost the belt. I was world champion for the past 6 years. If he wants to be world champion for 5 or 6 years, he'll have to fight until he's 40. Is he going to do that? No. I think he's just better off getting a good payday and saying, see you later. All right, so those are the words of Billy Joe Saunders. You wouldn't expect him to say anything too complimentary of Eubank Jr., but there was a time when Billy Joe Saunders said he wasn't particularly interested in a Eubank Jr. rematch, and there was also a time when Eubank Jr. said he wasn't particularly interested in a Billy Joe Saunders rematch, but now they're both saying they're interested in it. You see, in another video I did, I was talking about Felix Cash calling out Eubank Jr. I think that we will probably see Eubank Jr. Billy Joe Saunders 2 before we see Eubank Jr. versus Felix Cash. Because, of course, Billy Joe Saunders has been in the ring with Eubank Jr. before. Billy Joe Saunders is a former world champion, two-time, two-weight world champion. He's been in there with the likes of Gennady Golovkin. So, and of course, he's a bigger name. So financially, there's more of an incentive for Eubank Jr. to fight Billy Joe than Felix Cash. And even in terms of record and legacy, there's more incentive because you beat Billy Joe Saunders, then you right the wrong. You put the previous defeat behind you. So I think there's much more likelihood that we would see this than the Felix Cash fight. And this might actually be something we see before Eubank Jr. gets a title shot. Not that Eubank Jr. couldn't get a title shot right now, but the belts might be tied up with different people. We've got Canelo Alvarez possibly fighting Gennady Golovkin in the not too distant future. So is Gennady Golovkin going to take a fight against Eubank Jr. right now when he's really focusing on a trilogy fight against Canelo? I don't know. You've got Charlo over there with PBC. Is Eubank Jr. really going to fight for the world title in America? I mean, you got Murata. Would Eubank Jr. fly out to the United States? It's all up in the air at the moment in terms of Eubank Jr.'s plan. I know Kalle Sauerland has said, yes, Eubank's going to get big fights and we're going to do this, that, and the other. But I'll believe it when I see it because boxing is half of the fight outside of the ring. I mean, most of the fight is outside of the ring in terms of the politics and the business and getting fights made. And then you have to get in the ring and, of course, try and wrestle titles from champions. So, yeah, let's see whether Kalle Sauerland manages to do the business. But I suspect if he doesn't manage to do the business, if Eubank Jr. is frustrated with a world title fight not happening, he might have to take this Billy Joe Saunders rematch because that will then up the pressure on the other champions, or say the other champions, the champions, 160 pounds. That will up the pressure on them. I forgot to mention Demetrius Andrade, who's still a middleweight champion right now. That will up the pressure on them to fight a Chris Eubank Jr. And in fact, Demetrius Andrade, I suspect, would fight Eubank Jr. right now. I'm not sure whether Eubank Jr. would want to fight. I'm not sure whether his trainer, Roy Jones Jr., would want to fight. Because look, I know Eubank Jr. did a better job on Liam Williams than Andrade did, but for my money, that wasn't the same Liam Williams. The Liam Williams who fought Andrade took heavier shots and he took them better. He was taking big left hands and uppercuts and all kind of stuff. And although he did get dropped, he absorbed a lot of power punches. And a lot of people actually said to me in the Discord, or a few people did, that was the fight right there, which probably messed up Liam Williams' punch resistance, was the amount of punishment he took against Andrade. So anyway, the point I'm making is, for me, the Williams that fought Andrade was a better version than the one Eubank Jr. beat. I'm not trying to take anything away from Eubank Jr., but I'm just looking at the punch resistance. Yeah? I'm not saying that the Liam Williams who fought Eubank Jr. hit any less hard than the Andrade version. I'm not saying he was any less motivated. I'm not saying he was any less skilled. I'm just talking about the punch resistance. And the punch resistance, because his punch resistance wasn't there, he couldn't be as aggressive as he was against Andrade. You see it? So, anyway, Andrade didn't do as well against Liam Williams as Eubank, and therefore Eubank could use that to pressure Andrade into a fight. But again, stylistically, I don't think that's a fight Eubank Jr. would really want right now, and I certainly don't think it's a fight that his trainer Roy Jones Jr. would want right now. He knows boxing. Roy Jones Jr., as you should all know, he knows boxing, and I'm sure he looks at Andrade and thinks, nah, he's not the one for my guy right now. I'm sure he would much prefer Billy Joe Saunders, and I've long said I don't think Billy Joe Saunders is as good as Demetrius Andrade. I don't think he hits as hard. I don't think he's as awkward. And yeah, I just don't think he's as good. Not as rangy and tall either. So yeah, let's see what happens here. Let me know what you guys think in the comments below about the prospect of a rematch between Billy Joe Saunders and Chris Eubank Jr. How do you think it would go? Do you think, like Billy Joe Saunders said, Eubank Jr. has actually got worse and not better? Or do you think, like me, that he has actually improved? I think he's added strings to his bow. I'm not saying that he is now a genius at long range and he's now got this incredible jab. There was some extra hype that some people were putting on his jab, saying that he's learned this special Roy Jones jab where he turns a jab into a hook at the last second before the punch lands and it's got this tremendous power on it. Yeah, I'm not sure I'm convinced by all that, but I do believe that he has improved under Roy Jones. He's added certain aspects and elements to his game, which came together in the Liam Williams fight, as I predicted they would. All this time, where people have been saying that Eubank Jr. is just trying to imitate Roy Jones and it's not going to work for him, I was saying that it didn't look particularly convincing against some of the people he fought, like Marcus Morrison and these other people. But that's because he's trying things out. Those fights were more like sparring sessions. Yeah? He's trying things out. And so it may not look convincing right now, but once he steps up to a better level of opponent, he might pull out some of these skills and they're more effective than you expected them to be. They're surprisingly effective against a better level of opponent, particularly if that opponent doesn't think Eubank Jr. has those kind of skills. You see it? And I think that's what we did see against Liam Williams. So me personally, I think Eubank Jr., is adding more strings to his bow, and he is a better fighter now than when he fought Billy Joe Saunders first time around. So how that would translate in the fight, is Billy Joe Saunders, because of the experience he has now, more likely to beat Eubank Jr. in the rematch even than he was in the first fight? Or because he's had some up and down years, he's put a lot of weight on, he hasn't been so motivated, he obviously lost against Canelo Alvarez, and there was some controversy about whether he quit in the fight and then he went quiet afterwards. Is this more of a cash out fight for Billy Joe Saunders? Would he really be as up for this fight as he's going to make out? Is this Eubank Jr.'s perfect opportunity to get revenge over this guy? Who would you be picking in this rematch if it were to happen, let's say, next? Let me know in the comments below.